Okay, so Dr. Ellis here, and I'm going to dispel a few issues within this cluster slash chapter, and we both know they're the same thing. So let's present. All right, so obviously it's about intelligence. It's about differences in intelligence, differences in ability as well, which are two different things. And then we go on to talk about law. We talk about making some modifications or accommodations, but the chapter's not real specific. And then they go on to talk about gifted and talented students. Okay, so labeling theory goes back around 1950s, 1960s with a theorist called Fessinger. And the idea is if we impose a label on a child, the child's going to live up to the label. Okay? So if we label every child gifted, they're going to exceed beyond belief. Okay, or maybe not. If we label every child as having a disability, they're going to live up to that disability. That's the idea, and whatever characteristics go with that disability. So that's what the concept of self-fulfilling prophecy is. All right, so then we marry that to another theory from the 60s by a theorist called Goffman, who theorizes about stereotypes and stigmas. So the idea is if we stigmatize and make disability synonymous with bad or negative cognitions, then that child's going to suffer in school and be tormented by his peers, etc., etc. So there's an issue with identity there. That's what they're putting into the mix. Okay, but at the same time, we have more modern educational theory and actual studies where if we have a student in class with an intellectual disability, then and the children are aware that that student has an intellectual disability, they actually engage and interact because they can understand exactly what's going on with that student. They can understand why the characteristics are there. At the same time, I can say that there is stigma that occurs, and you have to see that schools are run by many generations of people. So I have people in schools that are younger than me, and I'm 46 now. People that are younger than me, and I have people in schools that are older than me. People that potentially are my children's age, because I have a 22-year-old, and my father's age, who's, say, in his 70s. Okay? So because you have this range of variation in generation, they're going to metabolize disability with the way that they grew up and were socialized to it and the differences. So where my father's generation might say, well, yeah, you never put a kid with a learning disability in a language or in a foreign language course because that's just too difficult to learn a different language. My son's generation says, why not, everybody in some kind of social paradigm in the class, learning through practical, world-based activities and using media, everybody can probably assimilate the same content. So again, this kind of drives, though, how things happen in schools. So when I was a guidance counselor in Toledo Public, there was the constant belief there from the principals who were, a couple of decades older than me, saying, yeah, you can't put a kid with a learning disability in a foreign language class. Independent of the fact that the learning disability might be dyscalculia. It might have something to do with math, not language at all. The positive side of actually using labels, though, is under the current law. So, under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and its reauthorizations over time, the whole idea is if the child is identified through Psych Ed assessment, and then we have a definitive label with characteristics of what are the student's functional strengths and limitations, kind of environment the kid's in, what daily tasks the student needs to perform related to that particular curriculum, we can then prescribe accommodations for that particular child. So without the label, the prescribed adaptations or modifications just don't happen. Okay, so then we go on to the issue of language. All right, so we talk about disability as the inability to do something. Again, we have to also metabolize that each child has functional strengths and limitations. A child with Down syndrome might be very social, and then social learning theory really is an engagement tool with that particular child. So we have to deal with also account for the functional strengths rather than just inability, and that's really a poor choice of words. I like to refer to it instead as a functional limitation. So we have a limitation in functioning at this particular point in time with this particular ability. Handicap, horrible word. Still, we use it widely. Disadvantage in certain situations. You should stay away from that word unless you're talking about golf. Principle of practice, avoid turning disability into a handicap. Again, so we all have ranges of ability in different things. Some of us might be very, handy, mechanically oriented. Some of us might be wordsmiths and can craft a sentence very well and have a very ample vocabulary, and others not. So the issue is we don't say that we don't have that ability, but we can possibly work to strengthen that ability over time. So there's some word choices that we need to stay away from. So confined to a wheelchair, victim of AIDS, victim of disease, that's what it said in your textbook. So we avoid letting the labels become powerful. And that's when it becomes something that stigmatizes, something that becomes disadvantageous to the student and the peers around them. We need to use first-person language. Always start with student. Student with a learning disability. Student with special needs. We hardly ever use special needs here in the U.S. In Canada, it is used greatly. Not special needs student. Okay, not slow learner. Not intellectually disabled student. None of those type of things. You don't say that kid is autistic or that kid's in special ed or SPED, which is even worse, services. No, instead we say the student is receiving special education services or the student is in special education service. The student with autism, student with a learning disability, student with an intellectual disability, etc. So now we talk about possible biases in the application of labels. Okay, so the problem is that labels can be a scapegoat in some way to exclude children. So we have an overrepresentation of disability categories related to, for instance, young African American males. So that's here in the States. In Canada, it's young Native Canadians, also known as First Nations Canadians, males. So they end up in special education services with a more frequent incidence. So they're more frequently put into that category and ending up in those services, which tells you that from the numbers that are in your textbook that this is a problem because they're overrepresented related to the population. And it doesn't have anything to do with race. It doesn't have anything to do with gender. It has a real problem with misidentification. So possible explanations, well, they go on to the nature-nurture debate again, right? So we talk about poverty rates. So that's a nurture issue, right? We talk about systematic biases in teachers' attitudes. So, this child is Latino. So again, from a racist basis, which is incorrect, the child is somehow inferior to his peers. Okay, so that's an incorrect assumption. So that's what they're talking about, systematic biases in teachers' attitudes. We're talking about teachers being racist, having misbeliefs about race and aptitude. Lack of preparation for teachers to work effectively with these populations. So because we have different behaviors from different groups of peoples, so I was a counselor, and I did both mental health counseling, and I was licensed across Canada and in the province of Ontario. And I was also a guidance counselor, like I said, in Toledo Public. So, African American students are characterized by being somewhat, more energetic, being more open to, showing behaviors and being more vocal. So that's a class of behaviors that I was taught in guidance and counseling that I can expect. Latinos are, and I lived in Brazil for 6 years, so, and my children are biracial. So I'll put that out there right now. So Latinos are characterized within the text and diagnostically as being more emotional, being louder, etc. Okay? But that's not all Latinos, and that is not all African Americans. That is, again, an easy label placed on people to characterize behavior. So, again, your textbook kind of goes in this direction, but it's just like any other factor in life. All people are different. We can't really class peoples into certain behaviors, but we do need to learn to be able to effectively teach with all these behaviors in the room, whether they're being exuded by Caucasians, Latinos, Asiatic Americans, or Native Americans, right? Or African Americans. So the issue is here, independent of race, we need to be able to deal with any behaviors. So, lack of classroom cultural compatibility. Only can you witness this by experiencing this, so I would suggest that you go out and you experience culture one way or another, and if you have been sheltered in one particular culture and one particular race and ethnic group over time, you need to break out of that and experience many for you to be able to serve many. Problems accurately assessing these students' abilities. Yeah, because we create tests that aren't good for all populations. That's the problem. What does intelligence mean? Well, so they come up with this scale, right? So we're talking about abilities. We talk about the inductive and deductive thinking, all those wonderful things. I once had a professor over at Bowling Green. He once told me, you're worth what you get. So the issue is, if you can actually use your intelligence and put it into practice, that's the true measure of intelligence. If you can have intelligence but you can't do anything with it, then it's not serving you to your full potential. It's not really getting you anything from it. So, and then we talked about, kind of the plasticity issue again of the human brain. So we talk about fluid abilities versus crystallized abilities. It's kind of the same type of analogy as brain functioning. Then we go on to Howard Gardner's theories of multiple intelligences. Okay, so it is debated, right? It's highly debated. And the take your textbook has on, hey, don't try to create lesson plans that include all 8 of these things, because you're probably going to fail. You try to adapt your lessons to differentiate them to what makes sense. Okay, so what makes sense, rather than forcing the musical, perhaps, into the situation. And there was a good description of that within the textbook of how you actually create multi-stages of a lesson plan, including several of those multiple intelligences. Again, it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. There have been criticisms on the implementation from the scientific community. It has been embraced by the educational community, but let's go on to the other one. So when we talk about the whole idea of differentiation and different sensory inputs, so we talk about the whole concept of multiple sensory inputs. So we want to be able to have the kinesthetic, and we want to have the visual, We want to have the auditory. So, we have the senses involved in representation of learning style. Okay? The only problem is that also is not one size fits all. So, for instance, this red octagon that says stop, children are socialized to this visually over time, and it's replicated over time, and then they learn a behavioral function related to this. So if they're driving a car or riding their bicycle, if they see one of these things, they stop. Okay, so that's the behavior that's elicited from the visual. At no point in time is it auditory, unless you have a high-end or specific area where we have a beep associated with lights with individuals who are blind that are crossing at a crosswalk. So for the most part, it never yells out, stop, stop, to actually have you stop your vehicle, or the child stops his bike. The child must fit into this particular learning style of being visual for this to function. At no point does the child go up and touch the sign to make sure it's an octagon before stopping the bike. So you see where my logic pattern is going here, right? So, okay, it's great that we can try to cater to these things and we differentiate within our classroom by doing this to best hit the largest possible target audience in terms of receiving the knowledge, but we also have to be well aware that the practical transposition, so that how we actually apply this out in the field, how students take this knowledge and apply it in a different setting, it's important to be representative of the setting. What does that mean? Well, that means you've got a bunch of different learners, so this is the front end of my motorcycle. So I decided to put this visor thing on. Okay, so this whole little detachable windshield quarter fairing headlamp visor thing. It's actually a headlamp visor. So you get the instructions and it looks like this. So you've got labels for the stuff, for the bits and pieces, for the parts, but you don't have an auditory description. You might have a written description of steps in the process, which it did come with, very brief. So what does this become as a task? It becomes a visual task, and it certainly becomes a kinesthetic task because I'm manipulating little bits and pieces until you actually get the fairing to fit so there's no gaps between it and the light, which means messing around with different spacers to actually get the fit that you need. Okay, so that's a different level, though, of engagement. That becomes trial and error, right? That becomes learning through failure that's forgivable failure. So that's another dimension to what we're talking about in terms of learning theory. So it's not just the sensory input, which is somewhat static in nature, right, in terms of differentiation, but how we actually achieve the cause and effect and how we can learn through failure that's not high stakes failure. So intelligence as a process. So this kind of describes it as, the thinking process, analytic intelligence, creative intelligence. Again, we're putting labels to different things. So it's the whole concept of we create different models to try to understand what's going on within our minds and to extrapolate out on that how children learn, right? So practical intelligence, adapting to an environment to succeed in a practical manner, career choice, social skills, etc. So we have a bunch of different theorists that give us a different, so like triarchic theory in this case, that allows us to try to understand those processes and apply it to different age children. Then your textbook goes over the history of intelligence. So we basically look for an age measure. So the mental age of this child is compared to the group, right? And the average intelligent benchmark, which is probably more important than anything else for you to understand, is 100. So again, 50% of the takers are above, 50% are below. Average score for IQ is 100. For an intellectual disability, it's usually below 70. So 70s are baseline. To drop below that, you usually get diagnosed as having intellectual disability, formerly known as a cognitive disability, formerly known as mental retardation. So, in terms of interpreting IQ, the first thing you need to understand is that the individual test is most valid because there's a clinician sitting in front of you and taking down your scores as they ask you the question. If it's a group administrated endeavor, so a bunch of kids in a room filling out bubble sheets related to the questions while the teacher reads the prompt or while the clinician reads the prompt, the margin for user error, like filling in the incorrect bubble, filling in two bubbles in the same line, and then having to recorrect the entire column of bubbles, the usability risk is higher, so that's why scores are less predictable. So it's user error that's the problem. Okay, we have to be worried about IQ tests for students from other cultures because, again, English is not their first language. Um, I bet you if I did an intelligence test in English and my wife, who English was her second language, did the same test in English, we might have different scores, and hers might be inferior to mine, even though I believe that she's probably more intelligent than me, and speaks three different languages. So you have to take the environmental issues into effect in this particular case. Then they talk about, hey, are we getting more intelligence over time? Yeah, I mean, I think we're doing better at nurturing children over time than perhaps we did 100 years ago. So yeah, this is kind of obvious that higher IQ tests relate to academic achievement. So obviously, and this is how we effectively talk about the difference between intellectual disabilities and gifted talented. That's a platform that they're working on to move forward here. Gender differences. So that's kind of been dispelled. I remember like coming up through the 70s and 80s, they love to talk about differences. But if we talk about intelligence, there's really no difference. If we talk about specific abilities, yeah, this persists as a belief that females are higher in verbal abilities and males are higher in visuospatial abilities. Not to say that that's going to be the case in every individual. That's the thing you always need to remember. It's not true in all races, ethnicities, nationalities. Hey, what happens if we all blend? Then what happens? So you can expect an evolution, right, over time of the way things work. So, and these large blanket statements. Differences come from learning, so again, nurture, not biology, nature. So, counter stereotypes about female math inferiority, again, I mean, a lot of young ladies that really can do math, and sciences, so I take these type of findings with a little bit of a grain of salt. Hereditary environments, guess what? Foreshadowing here, I would guarantee that heredity and environment probably both play a factor into it, but environment wins over heredity. So yeah, we talk about the nature nurture debate. So if we go back to the whole feral children thing, you see that if we don't actually have nurture, then there's going to be a deficit, right? And that can play out on IQ, that can play out on language, that can play out on physical development as well. So it's impossible to separate genetics from the environment in intelligent measures. Sure. I guess we see clinical studies of multiple generations of intelligence, and we also see multiple generations of intellectual disability to the point that in the 1930s in the US, there was a eugenics movement to try to sterilize children with intellectual disabilities, so they wouldn't procreate. So, and obviously that didn't happen long term, but it did happen in some cases and in some institutions. So, because of generational reproduction and the hereditary factor of low IQ, that's the reality. That was the mindset back then. Um, what we do need to do is we need to protect the rights of all children. Uh, Poor families, rich families with problems too, and ensure their education. Um, Make sure you understand the test. There's Burroughs' mental measurement text or mental measurement book that has every test ever printed and licensed in it. You can go in, you can see whether it was normed on a population that was diverse enough that matches your population. So in Toledo Public, I had a 93% African American population at school. So if they're applying clinical tests on these kids, I want to make sure that it's representative of an African American population, that they score the same as other populations. So they're not at a disadvantage when we come back and read the results and say, okay, so now the result was this, so now you qualify for special education services. Okay, so again, we talked about kind of learning styles into three traditions. So we have cognitive centered, personality centered, and activity centered. So it's again the way that we approach differentiation in this case. So do I need surface processing, focus on memorization. So rote memory, which was what was theoretically described historically in like one-room schools as kids memorize and then regurgitate. That's not always the case. I've done some research on 19th century schools, and there was also a lot of other stuff going on, which was deep processing. So the idea of hands-on learning and kind of project or product-based learning. So where the kids are getting their hands, they're actually building something to represent the concept. So again, we're talking about learning styles. So this is kind of a revisit for what we talked about. The issue here is you need to have the realization that to reach the largest possible target audience, you need to embrace the idea of spoken word, visual, as well as processing through tactile means. So in math, that could be as simple as counting beans or using manipulatives. Visuals, we have representations of things like touch math. So we have a visual representation of dots over numbers with the value count in them that students get exposed over and over to, and then they actually encode that as part of their lexicon of understanding what those individual numbers are valued. So we can do that to differentiate. Again, we can also having spoken word along with visuals. So what I'm doing right now is you've got a visual in front of you and I'm actually speaking over top of it, because some of you might process in a more auditory manner. So when I was doing my PhD at the University of Windsor, I was teaching at Bowling Green State University at the same time, twice a week. So I would put all my lectures through OCR, so optical character recognition, process them out to MP3 file. So all my readings for the week would be on separate MP3s, so separate audio files, and then I actually sped them up a little bit above average, and I would listen to them on my drive because I could decode that way efficiently and retain the knowledge. So that's the other thing. It's about retention of the knowledge. So I can throw a picture like this in front of you, so with a bunch of words on it, but you might never read them. So the processing isn't there, and it might not stick, right? It might not get encoded into memory. And if it doesn't get encoded into memory, it's not there to be pulled out later on to apply to something else. Same thing can be said auditorily. You might be able to tune out your professors, right? Or tune out your administrator or tune out your boss when they're saying something. Hopefully not your husband or wife. But when they're saying something to you, so it doesn't get encoded into memory, and then you have that moment that you wake up and you realize, oh crap, I haven't been listening to this person. What happens if they ask me a question? So the importance is to have multiple sensory inputs, and I like to think of it this way. It's kind of like muscle confusion. So if you work out, right, you don't want to work out, say, your biceps the same way every time. You want to confuse your biceps, and sometimes you curl, sometimes you use pulleys, right? You use like the wired system, right? Sometimes you do push-ups, sometimes you do pull-ups. I mean, all of these things work that muscle group, right? But it helps confuse the muscle, and it helps it build to be the best muscle it can be. The same thing can be said of sensory input. Multiple sensory inputs, auditory, seeing it. We have a huge memory for taste as well. So, as well as actually building something, building a product with our hands. So by doing that, it causes this sensory mix, this sensory confusion that allows us to encode the stuff into memory, right? Because we've done it in several different ways. We've seen it in several different ways. We've smelt it in several different ways. We've tasted it in several different ways. Yeah, I think you get the idea from what I just said in terms of learning styles. Let's talk about law. All right, so the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act has a few key concepts to it that you need to be aware of. Number one is FAPE, so free and appropriate public education. So the idea is I need to provide this child with the most appropriate educational setting possible. More and more, that looks like inclusion in the general education classroom rather than a segregated classroom. But just beware of that lingo, because that's really what we're talking about. So free and appropriate means in public schools, it's free services, even if that means designated specialized services, like for instance, speech pathology, like for instance, occupational therapy, like for instance, special education. Zero reject, no child can be denied. So once they're identified, and that's a tricky piece, once they're identified, then they can't be denied services. So we've got a bunch of categories in IDEA. You can pull IDEA online if you want to, in all of its different reauthorizations. Most students have, which is called a high incidence disability because it happens a lot, specific learning disabilities. When we talk about the concept of least restrictive environment, that's an interesting concept altogether. So again, that's why we kind of place inclusion as least restrictive. Restrictive would mean I'm locked in a room. Restrictive would mean I'm restrained in some way, and that could be a physical restraint, right? And we want to provide every child with the least restrictive environment to ameliorate, to better their learning, okay? So mainstreaming is the same thing as inclusion. So we put a child in a general education classroom, perhaps with some scaffolding, perhaps with some tech, assistive tech, perhaps with some additional services, in extreme cases with an aide, etc. Okay, but what happens if I've got like a kid using some technology? So I've got a child that has a hard time putting the semantics of language together when using a keyboard or using written language, so actually writing it out, okay, or printing it out. So what do I do with that child? I might be able to use something like voice recognition software, which is actually built into Google Chrome. You can do that right in a Google Doc now. So the child can speak if their oral prowess, so if their oral skills are better, right, than their actual written skills, then the child can speak, and it dictates for the child, right? It transcribes what the child's saying. So, how does that work in a group of, say, 29 other kids, though? It could be disruptive when they're actually working on written skills. So, in this case, it becomes more effective to remove the child to a smaller environment. So, just for that particular event, when the child's writing something by using his or her voice, we move the child to, say, a resource room, we move the child out in the hall, etc., for them to effectively do that so it doesn't disrupt the rest of the children when they're actually working on the same task but in a different format. All right, so that's differentiation right there as well, allowing that child to do the assessment in a different format by actually speaking it. We talk about integration, so fitting a child into existing class, inclusion, integrating all students into regular classes. Again, there's a lot of play on words here, so mainstreaming is effectively, hey, the child's going to class and we're dialing back on the actual accommodations, which, that has to happen over a prolonged period of time. Integration, again, we're talking about socially fitting a child into a class if we're talking about integration. And inclusion, we're talking about having children with different abilities, levels of ability, all in the same classroom, and that can include gifted and talented as well as children with disabilities. So when we talk about the IEP, so the Individualized Education Program, and a lot of people confuse it with IEP, Individualized Education Plan. So it's a legal document. Basically, it's a contract. So you need to treat it as a contract. So whatever's in there becomes law for this child. So if the school psychologist has identified these particular functional limitations and functional strengths, then they have assessed the child to the nth degree, done observations, right? And then suggested, probably along with a team of people, suggested accommodations or modifications that go into place for this particular child. And as a teacher, you are expected to follow these, which could include more time for you to prep, because you need to be able to treat it more universally. You need to plan for universality, universal design. You might have to learn the tech that the child's using to support. And these are all good things for you in terms of professional development. You should not walk into this with resistance. So components of the IEP, present level of academic achievement. So we take a benchmark and functional performance of what's going on right now. We set annual target goals for the child. We state what services, again, accommodations, modifications, could be a PT, could be OT, it could be speech pathology, it could be counseling services, etc. Explanation of program not in the regular classroom, so I'm not quite sure what they're meaning on this particular instance, but the idea is they can be in the classroom, they can be out of the classroom, and it's private information. So this is actually protected information that does not get disclosed outside. There also has to be an assessment plan if there are accommodations made for standardized tests, so in any way, shape, or form. Also, depending on which state you're in, there's outline for the child's age and when a transition plan needs to go into effect for the child as they transition to their next step in life. So what they're transitioning to from one school to another, or eventually out of the system and into work. So rights of students and families in IDEA. So there's quite a few that are specified. Number one is you need to maintain confidentiality. So that's information that you only talk about with the IEP team and other school professionals in confidence. Again, we have to plan around testing practices that don't discriminate against students from different cultural backgrounds. So if you have a student with a disability and they're from a different cultural background, you need to pay double attention to what you're suggesting in terms of testing. Parents have the right to see all tests, placement, teaching records. It's basically open book. Surrogate parent or custodian parents, if the parents aren't available. There's written notice of evaluation or change in placement, so the parents need to be informed of that, and most likely there will be a meeting discussing that. Parents' right to challenge program development for their child. So they have the right to input, and they have the right to an advocate being there as well. And they have the right to third-party evaluation. So if they want to bring in their own school psychologist, or psychologist, or professional, or paraprofessional, they can, or lawyer. Section 504 is for non-traditional special education services. So think about it this way. So if I have a child and the child's life is impacted by some form of disability or variance not accommodated under IDEA, it can be accommodated for under Section 504 of the Rehab Act. So, for instance, if I have a child that has, for instance, a latex allergy, that makes us in the school responsible to make sure there's no latex in that room. Okay? So that's where this accommodation kind of comes from, the idea of those type of accommodations. If I have a child with attention deficit disorder, so that doesn't fall under IDEA. It actually falls under 504. So I can do things in terms of creating a behavioral plan for this particular child to help them. The same thing with oppositional defiance disorder. If I have a child that's highly disruptive behaviorally, they can be placed on something like this because it is severely impacting a life event, which happens to be school and learning. And we make accommodations, so self-placement in the classroom. They're allowed to leave the classroom without having to ask permission because they feel like something's going to happen. Same thing can be said for panic disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder. If a child feels unsafe in that environment at that particular time, perhaps because there's an altercation going on, the child should be allowed to remove themselves from that situation, which would potentially aggravate the disorder. So you see the logic, right? So students with learning disabilities have learning disabilities. Think of it this way. So they're a child that perhaps struggles in any given area, right? So it's the acquisition of language, difficult reading, reasoning, math, etc. That does not mean they have an intellectual disability. Their IQ could be higher than yours, but there's a glitch in the programming. Some rewiring that needs to be done in terms of learning that allows us to remediate the problem in acquisition and get them back with the same target age group. So again, there's not a deficit in IQ. There's just been a deficit in ability and performance over time, and that could be because they were out of school for a year. That could be because they had a really bad teacher. That happens. That didn't teach the concepts. Could be because they were homeschooled, right? And the parent or the caregiver did not have the requisite skills necessary to actually do the homeschooling. There are a lot of factors here. Okay? And then they give you a bunch of characteristics. So, in learning disabilities, just like any other disability, early identification, same thing with intellectual disabilities, etc., autism as well. Early diagnosis is important because then we can do early intervention. So the more time we have to work with the child and with the parents, the more time we have to ameliorate the problems or to make better the situation and the capabilities of the child. What we do want to do is try to prevent learned helplessness. So consistent failure over time, which is kind of like the wait to fail model that we've chronically fallen into. Child fails, let's test them. Child fails, let's test them. Child fails, we finally get to test them. Oh, child has a learning disability. Then we get the services, but the child's 3 years behind now because they've failed 3 consecutive grades. So, I mean, that is a situation that places a child into believing that they can't learn, that they have no power in the situation, and they'll effectively shut down. That's what learned helplessness is. We never want to get ourselves into the situation. The potential of each child is always there. If we're not managing to bring that out of the child, then we as teachers have failed. Child fails, how about we flip it that way? If the child fails, it's your fault. It's not the child's fault, it's your fault. Because you did not give the child the requisite things that they needed to actually understand the concept. So they talk about a couple of approaches. They talk about direct instruction, which is just basically teaching, at the front of the room, again, with small incremental explanations, demonstrations. It's traditional teaching. I disagree that this is the most effective approach. I believe that if we do create steps in a process, that will help all children in their acquisition of a particular task. That's why we do things like task analysis. Try to figure out what the best strategy to teach children is from A to B. But again, we can play into those learning styles as well, because the child might have some functional limitations, but they also probably have some functional strengths. So we need to figure out how to tap into those to actually bring up the bar. Again, I think the textbook might be a little slightly belittling on the profession and the idea that you make short, simple verbal instructions. Readable instructions are important at the target age of reading that the child has. In terms of breaking down the instructions into assimilatable bits and pieces, that should be your goal for any lesson, for all students. So again, it's an interesting set of strategies that they're blanketing here. Each child is unique, and you need to figure out what best works for that particular child. Again, I feel like this is a little too basic, a little too rudimentary. So you have a lot of kids with ADHD. That's the idea. Okay. So again, your textbook talks about some identification. So basically, how to label kids. But guess what? Kids that fidget, they might just have a lot of energy. They might not have ADHD. They can't stay seated. Again, they might be a Brazilian kid that just has a lot of energy and was never taught that they need to stay in the seat. So they might have habituated to the idea that it's okay to stay standing. Talks excessively. Again, it just might be a kid whose parents talk excessively, and that's the case. Do not try to label a child that hasn't been clinically diagnosed already. And never, ever, ever say you should be on Ritalin or you should be on something else, because that is out of your purview in terms of your responsibility. And it's highly unethical, and honestly, it's illegal if you say that. You make that, because that's not your role. So, I like this one. Discover and use the kid's strengths. Any kid. All kids. Okay? There are some functional things for kids that have a lot of energy, so you can swap your furniture out for other things these days. I've got a 3rd, 4th grade split class teacher that has a full-time IS in his room, and at least 20% of his kids have some form of disability. So they have flexible seating. They kind of like work in pocket groups around the room. So They've got small clusters for groups to work together. They have carpets, they have kneeling desks. I've also seen exercise balls used for kids because that allows them to try to find their center of gravity all the time. Um, so it allows them that stimulus at the same time. You know, the whole um, the word's escaping me at the moment. The clinical word's escaping me at the moment. It allows them to actually have their body in motion, so they still have the movement, but it also allows them to stay in one spot. A lot of kids with communication disorders, including my little cousin, um, who's decades younger than me. So there's a lot we can do with speech disorders today. So obviously, you as the classroom teacher, you're not the clinician, but you need to remember that you're the first responder. So if you have a child that stutters, you have to worry about the other children in class. So you can't leave room for them to make fun of that child. You should never ever replicate that and belittle the child. Um, and you also have to have the patience to allow the child to express themselves, even if they actually have a problem with articulation, a problem with fluency, um, pitch, quality, loudness, any of those. So you just have to set the baseline in your class that everybody's equal in that class and that nobody's allowed to make fun of anybody else, and you take it for what it is. So while the child is working on remediating that, most likely with a speech pathologist, it's your role to allow them space, allow them time to be treated like anybody else, to express their knowledge. A lot of kids with emotional disabilities out there. Um, you know, the largest, I think the largest increasing population in schools that we see, and that's K through 16, that's K through college, is mental health disorders, because they're now being diagnosed. We now live in a more open society, society where people are less afraid of the stigma that's associated with it and are actively seeking help. So the realization here is that sometimes behaviors are just behaviors. Okay? The behavior's not meant to be towards you. The behaviors are just existent at that particular time in that particular individual. You, on the other hand, have the choice. You have a choice of internalizing that as something against you or simply as a behavior. You need to keep it as simply as a behavior because nothing's really targeted towards you as the professional in the room. So if you have a child that's aggressive, that aggression is coming most likely from somewhere else, because if you're doing your job, there shouldn't be any aggression there. If they're anxious, again, have we placed the child in a high stakes situation rather than you setting the pacing, you setting the bar, you understanding that we can learn through failure and allowing multiple attempts on any given assignment in a classroom, as we work towards mastery. So those are the things that we need to figure out, and you need to keep your baseline as the teacher, as the adult in the room, as behaviors just being behaviors, they're not towards you. In terms of disciplining students with behaviors, what if we never ever have to get to that point? What if you build such a rapport with your students that the discipline falls into place because they feel legitimately bad because they've failed you in some way, or they've wronged you in some way? That's the progression of what we're looking for. So you always want punishments that are fair. You always want punishments that you can walk back from, and always have the realization that if you're going to send that kid out of the room, that kid is going to come back, and you need to deal with that kid when the kid comes back. So You either deal with the kid at that particular time, or you don't deal with the kid at all, honestly. I've talked to principals, and now they have the operational status that if you send a kid down to them, they'll walk the kid back down to you, they'll take over your class, and you step out in the hall and you resolve your issues with the kid. Because you've made them your issue at that particular time. So the idea is you, if you're doing everything cognizant in terms of differentiating, you're accepting behaviors for what they are, and you're helping to try to shape those behaviors through modification strategies, and you've done all those steps along the process, you really shouldn't have behavioral issues. Let's talk about an extreme case. Let's say you have to have a child that's on a written behavior contract with a rationale. That behavioral contract's only as good as your administrators are supporting you. So, what are the repercussions if the child exudes this particular behavior? Is a repercussion they're getting suspended? Because that's a unreliable case. The maximum suspension in Ohio is 2 weeks out of the year. That's it. So once the kid meets those days, that kid's staying in school. Again, you never want to get to that situation. You want to own your domain through the appropriate behavioral strategies. Suicide. Well, textbook says that 10% of adolescents attempt. Bigger issues that you need to worry about are if the kid has a plan, and if there is talk of this, you always need to report. So immediately to your guidance counselor, to your pseudo administrator, your assistant principal, your principal, to discuss the issue, because the child can be held on observation if they're a threat to themselves or others, an imminent threat to themselves or others. So if the child says, I'm thinking about committing suicide, you should approach the issue by saying, okay, so let's talk about what's going on, and why that would be the case. And then once they feel safe with you, then you liaison a meeting with the guidance counselor. You walk them physically down to the guidance counselor. Then the guidance counselor can decide whether they're going to call in, honestly, the police department to go under observation for a few days to see whether they really are legitimately a risk to themselves. You do have the ownership, though, of reporting. And different populations, there are different risk factors. Certainly in my native Canada, more remote, Native Canadian First Nation communities, sometimes unfortunately children, they commit suicide, and then their friends commit suicide, and it becomes a snowball of those particular events. So warning signs: anytime a kid doesn't sleep for multiple days or has erratic sleep, erratic behaviors, habits that you haven't seen before, you should be concerned. You should ask what's going on. You should act on suspicion. So you talk to the student directly, you show interest. Again, the biggest issue is if the child has a plan. So I'm going to take a bunch of pills that I have access to. I'm going to use this razor blade that's in my book bag right now to slit my wrists or my jugular. Then you know it's imminent. If they have devised a means to kill themselves, then you know it's an imminent issue. It needs to be dealt with right then and there, and nothing else takes priority above that. Drug abuse. Again, the textbook tries to line it up with race, and they try to line it up with other things. So I worked in Toledo Public, and there was a drug problem there. I worked in a very exclusive school in Rio de Janeiro, and there was a drug problem there, where the kids had money, so they just used different drugs. So instead of weed, they're using, cocaine. So, you can try to put some kind of socioeconomic factor on it, but it's not reality. If kids have access to drugs and they decide to experiment, and again, that's going to happen, then you need to be able to deal with that and have a dialogue about that. The more engaged they are in school in positive relationships, the less likely they are to use. So, and again, scare tactics are ineffective. So the whole scared straight program of the 1970s, 1980s doesn't really work. Students with intellectual disabilities. So again, we talked about this before. If the IQ is below 70, that's usually where the identification point is. I like to think about it this way. In this case, we're usually making modifications in curriculum. So if I use my classical example, which happens to be the concept of recycling. Okay, so let's say you have in your science textbook the whole idea of recycling, why it's done, the economics of why it's done, and reappropriation of materials, breakdown, how long it takes to break down plastics, et cetera, from a scientific perspective. Okay, so if we take a child with an extreme intellectual disability and we want to modify that curriculum, it could be as simple as them understanding that they recycle tin or metals in one bin, plastics in another bin, and paper in another bin. Okay, so it can be modified so they understand the behaviors associated rather than the theoretical components associated and all that backstory. Again, we have a whole bunch of other genres of disability. I've worked with children with cerebral palsy, so usually there's a severe issue in motor control. But we have adaptations that we can make in terms of this for students. So if we have a severe slurred speech, we can use something that speaks for them that they type into. So that's a possibility. For spasticity, so if I have tremors, I can use things like weighted cuffs to slow down the tremors. So that's a possibility. Epilepsy, this is more about you being aware of how you respond to a child with epilepsy in your class and the social parameters, because again, there might be a bowel bladder control loss. So the reality is the children in the classroom need to understand what's going on so they're not fearful. And they have to be respectful of the individual who has the seizure at that particular time. You should consult with the parents about disclosure, though, of whether they want to disclose the class or not. Visual impairments, so we talk about low vision. We can make curricular modifications by making print larger. We can make it more high contrast by putting overlays on top of textbooks. So we can put something like, yellow overlay if a child has some form of scotopia. We can also use large screens to zoom in on the material as well. So we can use something like a 32-inch screen. And an Elmo or something that actually projects what's below it, like a textbook, onto the screen so the child can manipulate it. Deaf or hearing impaired, usually the biggest issue here in terms of making an accommodation would be using something like an amplification or a FM system, so a frequency, just like FM radio, frequency modulation system. So basically what happens is you as a teacher would wear a transponder. So you wear a microphone and something that sends out an FM signal, and then the child can plug that right into their hearing aids. Now, you have to adapt instruction because you have to have the realization that if other children are speaking, the child's only hearing you through the hearing aid, most likely, and not the peers. So if you go to a turn and talk type strategy with a peer, you need to make sure that the system gets switched off and the child's reset back to the normal hearing aid settings. Or parallel, if you have a large group discussion, you have to repeat the question so the child's hearing it through the microphone. Autism spectrum, again, the incidence is increasing for autism spectrum. This is actually how I started my career in education. It was working as a job coach with young adults with autism. So characteristics, I had a student this week tell me, that the phrase these days is, if you've met an autistic child, you've met one autistic child. You haven't met them all. So you have to keep that again in mind. It's an individual by individual case. Classically, you're talking about avoiding eye contact, not sharing feelings, not being able to verbalize feelings, not having interest in others. Although I would dispute that. Sometimes nonverbal, sometimes verbal, especially on specific topics. Need routine, yeah. So we can create accommodations like visual calendars for the day, so the child knows exactly what sequence of events going on. That takes some of the anxiety out of the situation. So Asperger, we talk about being able to read social cues. Classically right now in the media, the whole idea of Sheldon on Big Bang Theory as having Asperger's, some of the behaviors there, yes, some of the behaviors there, no. Again, though, you have to have the realization, though, that the intelligence is there. So it's not an intellectual disability, it's a social behavioral issue, okay? Then we talk about the pyramid that is RTI. So the idea is that we scaffold things that we work progressively over time. So, the idea is to not have any accommodations, and then you have in-class accommodations, and then maybe you have a pull-out program for specific targeted behaviors or curriculum. So everybody should start in that big general population before we identify who needs what and try to keep them in that population before they get segregated to the next level. Then they go on to talk about gifted and talented. I think that's pretty self-explanatory there, although realize that they do also have some behavioral issues and necessities as well. At the same time, I would put a caveat on the fact that your textbook in a previous chapter said that independent of ability, students should all be in the same room. Even the gifted, because the gifted can then learn to, and they shouldn't skip grades because then they have the chance to develop the social behavior and relationships and understand the range of ability themselves, and instead of becoming disenfranchised and ostracized and on the fringe. And I'm going to end it there.